Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today we'll be talking about the English colonies, particularly those in a region known as the Chesapeake. But to look at that, we first have to look at the wealth that Spain won in the New World and the jealousy that created in England. Because England wanted to seize Spain's wealth, both directly from the galleons bringing gold and silver back to Spain, and by seizing territory in the New World and settling it. Some of this was obviously economic, some was clearly territorial, but behind it there was also ideology. As Spain saw itself as a defender of Catholicism in these early days of the Protestant Reformation, whereas England was very much a Protestant country. Indeed one where King Henry VIII had begun the Protestant Reformation from England's point of view by divorcing a Spanish princess who was his first queen. And so England saw itself as defending Protestantism. Except England in the 1500s did not have a large navy, or much of a navy at all, although the Tudor monarchs had tried to modernize and professionalize what they had. Rather, they depended on privateers, privately owned and armed ships, licensed by the English government to attack countries that England was at war with, mostly raiding merchant ships and seizing their cargo, seizing Spanish galleons carrying treasure, but even raiding, sometimes conquering, entire Spanish cities in the New World. The Spanish called these privateers sea dogs, or far worse, I'm sure. And among the most famous of these sea dogs was Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake. But while individual sea dogs might be great sailors, overall, for most of the 1500s, the Spanish Navy ruled the seas. They might lose an individual ship here or there, but they kept anyone else from colonizing the New World, except that portion of Brazil allotted to the Portuguese. The English did claim some land in North America, which they named Virginia, in honor of the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I. And there even tried to set up a colony, which they called Roanoke, on Roanoke Island in what is now modern North Carolina, in 1587. But in 1588, the King of Spain, Philip II, planned to invade England with the goal of overthrowing Queen Elizabeth and perhaps placing himself on the throne. Indeed, the previous Queen of England had been his wife Mary, nicknamed Bloody Mary. However, they had had no children together, and so when she had died, the throne had passed to her sister Elizabeth. But Philip, with the blessing of the Pope, who described this as a crusade against Protestantism, put together an armada, a massive fleet, sometimes known as the Invincible Armada. He had 130 warships and other ships, 8,000 sailors, 18,000 soldiers, 2,500 cannon. He was to sail from Spain, or rather his fleet was to sail from Spain to the Netherlands, which Spain also controlled, although they were fighting to retain control of it. There they would pick up 30,000 more troops and invade England. But on the way to the Netherlands, the Spanish Armada was met by a smaller but better organized and better led English fleet, and led by sea dogs like Sir Francis Drake. And in desperation, the English took old ships, loaded them with tar, lit them on fire, and let them drift into the line of battle to terrify the Spanish, which they did. When ships were made of wood and coated in tar to waterproof them, and often held vast stores of gunpowder, fire could be incredibly deadly. And many sailors did not know how to swim. So the fire ships drifting towards the Spanish lines caused them to panic and scatter. Once scattered, the big Spanish ships could be picked off one at a time by the smaller but more maneuverable English ships. And so the Spanish fleet tried to sail for home. But the way wind and weather currents work, Many of them could not sail directly back to Spain. It's hard to just turn a big galleon around. They had to sail all the way around the coast of England and Scotland, where, near the coast of Ireland, they were blasted by a mighty storm, causing ships to crash into the coast of Ireland or simply be lost in the frozen waters off its coast, a storm the English described as the Protestant Wind. And many of those Spanish sailors shipwrecked in Ireland were later killed by English soldiers there, suppressing the Irish. Now, the Protestant wind did not end Spain's power, but it weakened it very significantly. Because after this, not only the English, but the French, the Dutch, and to a much lesser extent, some other countries, could finally begin to explore the world and colonize it seriously. There was certainly the danger of Spanish attack, but the Spanish no longer completely controlled the sea. The world was open to others, and they exploited it. And it was also seen as a great symbolic victory for Protestants everywhere. But while the English did defeat the Spanish Armada, it did keep them busy for a while. And so they weren't able to check on their colony in Roanoke for a couple of years. When they finally returned to resupply it in 1590, all the settlers had vanished. The word Croatoan had been carved into a nearby tree, and some local Indians some still have legends about adopting some of the colonists. And some of their family names occasionally appear amongst Indians living in Virginia. Many of them probably fled inland. There is some evidence that they survived into the early 1600s until they were killed by the Indian chief known as Powhatan, perhaps early in 1607. Now in 1606, a new king of England, James I, divided England's claims in North America between two private companies. The Virginia Company of London, which would have the southern half of England's claims in North America, and the Plymouth Company, which would have the northern half, although in fact the two companies' claims would overlap a bit in the middle, which would be a long-running trend among the English colonies and other colonies in the Americas, which would be overlapping and conflicting boundaries. So, good move there, King James. Now, both of these companies, whose land claims stretched to the South Sea, as the Pacific Ocean was often referred to. They didn't know where it was, but their claims went all the way there, wherever it was. These companies had the right to settle there. Both of these were joint stock companies, which is to say that investors or adventurers purchased stock in these companies, sharing the expense of starting a company and sharing the profit if it was successful, and sharing the burden of the loss if it was not. Indeed, companies like this would be how England, later Britain, would settle many of their colonies in the 1600s and 1700s. With the British government granting companies the right to trade and settle in certain areas, but largely allowing them to manage things themselves, unless they messed up a place that was really valuable, and England felt they had to step in to organize things better. But company-owned colonies, or sometimes called charter colonies, because the company had a charter, were very important. It also meant the government did not have to spend much money to set up a colony. In 1607, 100 Englishmen arrived in Virginia and established a colony they named Jamestown after King James. Most of these men, and the Virginia Company itself, hoped they would find quick supplies of gold just like the Spanish did. Indeed, they imagined gold was just lying around in Spanish territories. They also imagined that while mining might be hard work, they could just make the Indians do it. So the colonists who went to Virginia were not farmers or frontiersmen. Most of them were gentlemen, unaccustomed to labor, expecting others to work for them, or skilled craftsmen trained to work with gold and silver, but not, say, to be blacksmiths or carpenters. There were a few experienced soldiers and others among them, and most of them were not men accustomed to or expecting to do hard work. Unfortunately for them, the colony was established in a bad, swampy, malarial location, and they had too few willing workers. They were looking for a quick profit, not planning in most ways for the long term, and were surrounded by hostile American Indians, led by a chief typically known to us as Powhatan or Powhatan. All that was more of a title and not really his personal name. Furthermore, even though there was plenty of wildlife to hunt and fish to catch, the colonists could not manage to feed themselves. Furthermore, in Jamestown, the Virginia Company, also known as the London Company, had a plan of communal work. Everyone would work together and share what they produced. But, as is often the case with communistic plans, this did not work out too well. Englishmen were too individualistic to work for the community, apparently. So the colony seemed to be a failure and remained one for some time. In the first 15 years of the colony, of about 4,270 settlers who went to Virginia, at least 3,300 of them, about 80%, died, primarily of disease or conflict with the Indians, sometimes of starvation, although people managed to die of all sorts of things. The most famous case in the early history of Jamestown was, of course, the case of John Smith, one of the few men with actual military or other practical experience. Although in December of 1607, he was captured by Chief Powhatan's Indians and apparently sentenced to death by having his skull smashed with a war club. But, as he was laid across a rock, about to have his brains dashed out, Powhatan's daughter, known as Pocahontas, threw her body across him and saved his life, in what Smith reported as an act of her falling instantly and madly in love with him, but was probably a ritual meant to show Powhatan's power and dominance over the region. He could have killed John Smith, but he chooses to show mercy symbolically through his daughter. For one thing, she was about 10 years old, so hopefully she was not in love with the middle-aged Smith. And there's no evidence they had a personal relationship after that, although Pocahontas would remain an important friend of the colonists. Indeed, later, when she would be captured by the colonists during a war, her father would make no serious effort to ransom her back, which she, I think, would resent for the rest of her life. 1608, the first relief ship arrived, and of the first 100 settlers, discovered 62 of them were dead, and the colony in general poorly led, at which point John Smith took command of the colony, and that was all that kept the colony alive throughout the rest of 1608 into early 1609. He issued the famous order, borrowed from the Bible, "He who shall not work shall not eat." He put everyone to work, and during the second winter, of 200 residents in Jamestown, only 12 of them died. And the English kept it up. In 1609, a second relief expedition set out from England, but got shipwrecked in the Bahamas, probably an inspiration for Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. Furthermore, in Jamestown, much of the remaining grain was eaten by rats. So the winter of 1609 to 1610 was known as the starving time. Indians killed livestock to make things harder for the settlers. Settlers starved or ate cats, rats, dogs, snakes, horse hides. They even dug up dead bodies to eat. One man was convicted for killing, salting, and eating his wife, for which he was executed. Whether they ate him after they executed him, I am not sure. But the following May, 1610, the survivors of the shipwreck in the Bahamas, who had managed to build a new ship, sailed to Virginia and found the starving remains of the colony and decided they wouldn't stay. The survivors of the Bahama shipwreck and the survivors of the starving time loaded up on their ship and set sail down the James River to the Atlantic Ocean, planning to sail to England. And yet, on the way down the river, right before they could reach the sea, they were met by yet another supply expedition led by Lord de la Warr. He led everyone back to Jamestown, completely ended the system of communal work and set up private ownership of land, and the colony became more efficient, although still troubled by malaria and by warfare with the Indians. And of course by the fact they never found gold, nor silver, nor rare spices, and they never managed to enslave the Indians, at least not anytime soon. But they did, at last, find something that would make money. Indeed, something the Spanish were already selling profitably in Europe, and that was tobacco, which John Rolfe, one of the survivors of the shipwreck in the Bahamas, began to raise in 1612, and eventually in 1617 was able to ship back to England. And while the 3 shillings a pound that Virginia tobacco could sell for was much less than the 18 shillings a pound the Spanish got for their tobacco, it was still very profitable. Indeed, the first thing in Virginia to turn any kind of profit. And so Virginia was perhaps worth continuing to settle. But, tobacco is a lot of work to grow. Not just preparing the field and planting the seeds, you have to tend the plants and take care of them. It's a lot of work to harvest. And man, Virginians don't want to do that kind of work. And originally, they tried to enslave the Indians. But in general, they could simply escape into the wilderness. It was their home long before it was the home of the English. Others, of course, died of disease, suffering from that just as badly as the Indians who met the Spanish did. Others died of overwork. So, the English also began to bring indentured servants, whom we'll discuss more, to the colonies in large numbers. At first, these indentured servants worked for the company, the Virginia Company, for agreeing to work for the company for a certain number of years in exchange for the company paying their way to Virginia. Later on, most indentured servants worked for some private landowner who paid their way over instead. And besides the labor of some Indians and many indentured servants, some labor, and eventually the majority of it, would come from African slaves. Now, the first Africans sold in the English colonies were purchased in Virginia from a Dutch warship in 1619. At least probably. There is some debate about the status of these very earliest African slaves in Virginia, that perhaps they were some form of indentured servant who might eventually gain their freedom, or at least that their children might be born free, that it was not exactly the same as the chattel slavery that came later. Slavery, as we'd really think of it, wouldn't become firmly entrenched in Virginia until kind of the later 1600s. But this is a beginning, a very unfortunate one. But at first, Virginia did depend largely on indentured servants, and people who typically chose, although occasionally were forced, to come to the New World. Occasionally people were transported as punishment for a crime, or found this a way to pay off debts. But they would sign an indenture, an agreement to work for a set number of years, usually 4 to 7 years, for whomever paid their way. Although in some cases, their indenture could be sold. They might end up working for someone else. At the end of their term of service, indentured servants would be freed and typically given a token payment for their labor, clothing, some tools, sometimes a small amount of land. And there are a couple incentives for the big landowners to bring over indentured servants. Obviously, it gives them the labor of the servant for a number of years, but Virginia and also Maryland had a system known as the Headright System, and some other colonies had similar schemes as well. In Virginia and Maryland, if you brought an indentured servant to America, you got 50 acres of land to encourage you to bring people over and populate the colony. All is true, any free man who paid his own way also got 50 acres of land. But this largely meant that some very wealthy men had the work of many servants and lots of land for them to work on. Again, the possibility of purchasing your own way over and getting some land, or of possibly getting some land after gaining your freedom from your indenture, did create a small class of yeoman farmers in Virginia, small independent farmers who worked their own land and supported themselves. Indeed, the independent yeoman farmer would become a very important ideal in America in general and Virginia in particular, of the good, independent, self-sufficient citizen. And as free men, whether yeoman farmers or large landowners, they felt that they deserved, as all Englishmen had, a say in their government. After all, landowners back in England could elect members of Parliament, the House of Commons. And so the independent farmers of Virginia wanted the same thing. In 1618, the Virginia Company agreed to let them elect an assembly, which met for the first time in 1619 as the House of Burgesses. And while it did not initially accomplish much, it was the first representative government created in the English colonies and would set a precedent for self-government and elected government in America, a precedent that would be very important for Virginians and for Americans as a whole. So the year 1619, Virginia would give us perhaps the best of America in the foundation of the House of Burgesses, and perhaps the worst of America in our first purchase of slaves. And so, with more and more immigrants, voluntary immigrants, indentured immigrants, imported slaves, coming to Virginia to work the tobacco boom, the Powhatan Indians became increasingly concerned. And they had always been somewhat hostile and a danger to the Virginians. And they and the Virginians had often fought, treating each other quite brutally. There had been periods of peace, including one brought about in part by the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe in 1614. And furthermore, while the English were clearly very dangerous, particularly under the leadership of Lord de la Warr, they did have many valuable trade goods, woven cloth, metal tools, guns, and other desirable stuff. And so eventually Chief Powhatan reached kind of an accommodation with the English. But after he died, his brother, Opechancanough, perhaps, may have seemed friendly at first, but was increasingly worried about the growth of the English colony and decided he would drive the English out of Virginia for good before it was too late. Except perhaps it was already too late. An Indian who had converted to Christianity warned his English employer of Opechancanoug's plan in time for Jamestown to be partially prepared for the attack. While the attack was still brutal, the Massacre of 1622 slaughtered 347 out of 1,240 English colonists, about 28% of the population. That would be close to 100 million today. But the surviving English descended on the Indians just before the harvest, killed all the Indians they could, burnt their corn, made treaties with the intention of breaking them in order to gain advantage. One of them bragged about inviting Indian leaders to a peace talk and serving them poisoned wine. And these tactics were so dirty, they were called Irish tactics, because up to this point, the Irish were the only people the English had fought with the intent of exterminating them. And so the revenge of the English upon the Indians was terrible. There may, although I'm not really sure how we know, but there are historical demographers who try to figure these things out. There may have been 20,000 Indians in Virginia when the English arrived. When the Virginia government did an official count in 1669, the result was 2,000. If these numbers are accurate, a big if, I believe, it indicates a 90% decline in the Indian population in 62 years. Of course, the massacre hurt the English too at first, and then hurt the Indians as the English got their revenge. But for the English, there was a longer-term harm to come out of this. because prior to this, while the Virginians had certainly been growing a lot of tobacco, they had been attempting to develop other industries as well, like glassworks and ironworks. Some mining had begun in the backcountry. But what factories were being built were destroyed during the Indian attacks. And the risk of future Indian attacks was such that many people were unwilling to invest in something that would take many years to pay off. And so they stuck instead with the simpler, more straightforward production of tobacco, preventing Virginia from developing a diverse economy and keeping it dependent on a tobacco monocrop, and in turn, eventually dependent upon slavery. So, after 17 years of the Virginia Company not being particularly profitable, King James I dissolved the Virginia Company's charter and made Virginia a royal colony under direct royal control. Although the king never visited Virginia himself, he did appoint a governor who would rule in his place, alongside a council of advisors chosen by the governor from local leaders, and elected House of Burgesses. Well, as I've mentioned, the tobacco monoculture of Virginia was labor intensive. It also required large amounts of land because tobacco pretty rapidly wears out the soil. It depletes the nutrients in it, ruining the farmland. So tobacco farmers needed to be able to keep expanding to keep the economy viable. Fortunately, the Headright System seemed to solve both these problems of land and labor. The Headright System, of course, encouraged people to bring indentured servants to Virginia to provide cheap labor, and, of course, gave large grants of land, which could be farmed by those indentured servants. Although a lot of land was left unused, but with the knowledge they would have to use it eventually as the current farmland became depleted. And this supply of indentured servants was important because of the high mortality rate in Virginia. In reality, not that many indentured servants outlived their term of service, at least in the first few decades of Virginia's existence, although many big landowners died young too. Indeed, in Virginia, at least in the mid-1600s, there came to be a time where men died and their wives inherited their estates. Back in England, land almost always went to the oldest son, but in Virginia, where there was not always much family, a woman might inherit her dead husband's estate. She might then marry again, and her second husband might die and she might inherit his estate. So that some widows might gain quite a bit of economic power and thus unofficially kind of social and political influence too. Some have even described this period as a widowarchy, of Virginia being ruled by its widows. And this was another thing keeping Virginia's colonial elite in fairly small, fairly self-contained, and pretty firmly at the top of society. Although there were some exceptions. As I've already mentioned, some people did pay their own way to the New World, creating a small class of independent yeoman farmers who had their own land and worked it themselves. Furthermore, as time passed and people moved away from the swamps around Jamestown, the mortality rate declined. More indentured servants did begin to survive to gain independence and wanted land of their own. And so as Virginia spread out, it began to stratify into two societies. Near the coast was a region, and eventually a culture, known as the Tidewater. Here, the rivers are so wide and so deep that they're influenced by the tides of the ocean, which is so close by. And so large ships can sail or simply be pushed by the tide up these wide, deep rivers and dock perhaps pretty deep into the state, load up tobacco for shipment back to England, and the tide will pull the ships back down when it's time to go. But eventually you reach a place known as the fall line, where the with waterfalls, where the rivers become shallow. And beyond that is the backcountry, where people tended to be poorer, transportation was harder, they were more distant from the centers of the economy and culture. A region also sometimes called the Piedmont, or foothills. And there came to be real tension between the Tidewater aristocracy and the poorer backcountry people, who often felt that the Tidewater Gentry did not understand or care about their problems. And also led to tension between the backcountry people who wanted more land and the Indians, who of course wanted to keep their land. And there was tension in England too that spilled over into the New World. Of course, for years there had been growing tension between King Charles I, who believed in absolute royal authority and supported a pretty conservative Church of England, and an English middle class who was growing in power and wealth and who prized their voice in Parliament, which they believed should be able to limit the authority of the king in some ways. Furthermore, many of those middle-class members of Parliament were Puritans, who wanted to reform or purify the official Church of England, which they felt still had too many Catholic traditions. And this political and economic and religious tension broke out in 1642 into the English Civil War, which we'll discuss more tomorrow. But the English Civil War was fought by, on one side, supporters of the king, known as Royalists because they supported the royal family, also known as Cavaliers, from a word for knight, as many of them were from the upper class, many were knights. Although there were also many poor people who supported the king, especially rural people who did not really feel the urban middle class who tended to support Parliament had much interest in the traditions or problems of the countryside. Supporters of Parliament were known as parliamentarians, or more often as Roundheads, because by custom many of them wore their hair cut relatively short. Again, these were generalizations. At first, the Royalists or Cavaliers won some battles, but the parliamentarians or Roundheads became increasingly successful and also increasingly fanatical under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. And to make a long story short, they ultimately won the Civil War and executed King Charles I. Although eventually, under Cromwell's leadership, England would effectively become a military dictatorship under his control, until he died and was replaced by one of his younger sons, who in turn was soon thrown out and replaced by King Charles II, the son of the executed Charles I. But during and right after the English Civil War, when Parliament was in charge, many of the Cavaliers who had supported the king fled to Virginia, which ever since has been nicknamed the Cavalier State. And the Cavalier, dressed sort of as if he's from the mid-1600s, is one of the mascots of the University of Virginia to this day. The governor of Virginia, William Berkeley, was even briefly forced out of power, which would just be one of the problems that he would face. Now, he also had trouble, and had for some time had trouble, with the people of the backcountry. Because after Opechancanough had been killed in 1646, the Tidewater Gentry, Virginia's upper class, had tried to maintain peace with the Indians. Warfare was expensive and annoying, and the Tidewater people already controlled all the land they really needed. But for the small farmers trying to gain their own land, for newly independent indentured servants whose term was up, the only free land for the taking was in the backcountry and was still occupied by the Indians. And so many people in the backcountry wanted the Virginia government to help them force the Indians off their land, whereas the Virginia government was doing all it could to maintain peace with the Indians to avoid the expense of another war. And so many people in the backcountry really felt mistreated and neglected by the government in Jamestown, and looked down upon by the upper class along the coast. And then a man arrived to take advantage of all this discontent. Nathaniel Bacon, who had recently come to Virginia from a wealthy family in England, who'd sent enough money for him to set up 2 plantations, having gotten into some scandals back home. So he was sent to Virginia to get him out of the way. But having come from a relatively upper-class family in England, he saw himself as better than the Tidewater elite. He saw them as local hicks who thought they were something special, but weren't nearly as good as he. On the other hand, because there wasn't much land left to purchase in the Tidewater, his new plantations were in the backcountry, and he saw how the people there felt mistreated by the Tidewater upper class, who, again, to him, were not that high class. And he saw their desire for seizing land from the Indians. And so he decided to organize this discontent. And 1676 led Bacon's Rebellion. This was made up in large part of former indentured servants, small farmers from the frontier, even some slaves, hoping to gain their freedom. And at a time when that was more flexible in Virginia as an institution than it would soon become. First they massacred local Indians, and then marched to Jamestown to overthrow the colonial government and burn Jamestown to the ground. Indeed, when the order was eventually restored, it was decided that Jamestown was, frankly, in such a crummy malarial location, it wasn't worth rebuilding. When they finally built a new colonial capital, it would be a bit up the road at Williamsburg. But for now, Berkeley was forced to flee the colony. A new House of Burgesses was created, and it gave the right to vote to all free men in Virginia. In the early days, all free Englishmen could vote, but in the mid-1600s, that was restricted to land-owning men only. And this expanded the vote again. It limited the power of the governor. They issued the Declaration of the People of Virginia, criticizing Berkeley for unfair taxes, for appointing his friends to government offices, for not protecting the people from the Indians. This is sometimes seen as a forerunner of the American Revolution, in which independence would be declared 100 years later. People demanding more rights and more representation. But on October 26, 1676, Bacon, pictured there, died of dysentery, pictured there. Some of his followers were tricked into giving up their weapons by an offer of pardon, which was not always given. Others simply gave up, and some of the rebel leaders were then hanged. Most, though, were pardoned. Indeed, some of their leaders eventually became part of Virginia's ruling class. Governor Berkeley briefly returned to power before being replaced by the king with another governor the king hoped might be more successful. But Virginia's upper class had to do something, and they saw that part of the problem had been so many indentured servants living to get their freedom at the end of their indenture. And so perhaps having a large free underclass was a bad thing. So the shift really moved towards an unfree underclass. While Virginia certainly continued to have indentured servants, and they were still important, slavery became far more important and increasingly came to be defined by race. Prior to this, slavery had at least sort of been justified on religious grounds, in that a Christian, it was said, could enslave a non-Christian, and often one Christian denomination would claim other Christian denominations weren't really Christian, and some still do that, and I'm totally not getting into that argument today. But that creates a problem, because as a Christian you have to convert non-Christians to Christianity. But if you're a slave owner, and slavery is based on owning a non-Christian, if you convert him to Christianity, you would have to free him, and that's just all awfully awkward. By shifting a definition to one based on race, though, that can let you keep your slaves. A non-Christian can become a Christian. A black man can't really stop being a black man, unless maybe it's Michael Jackson. And so, slavery came to be very much entrenched by race. And yet, oddly, almost perversely, the creation of a permanently enslaved underclass helped to create, according to some historians, kind of a sense of equality among the white people of Virginia. So that both rich and poor saw themselves as being, in some ways, part of the same class, as all being free. And because they were all free, they were equal. Indeed, it would be Virginians who would be among the leaders of the American Revolution, demanding freedom, and describing people who would take their freedom as trying to enslave them. Perhaps no one can value freedom as much as someone who sees, as clearly as a slave owner, what it means not to have it. And Virginia had other problems too. The overproduction of tobacco led to falling tobacco prices. And falling tobacco prices, in turn, meant that many Virginia planters ended up deep in debt to the merchants in London. Because most Virginians did not sail to London to sell their tobacco, someone sold it for them. And then would take that money to buy all the latest fashionable things from London. The fanciest china, the latest clothing, the longest wigs, the fanciest carriages, and so forth, and ship it off to Virginia. So Virginia's upper class could try to imitate the upper class of England. Again, ended up deep in debt in many cases. But, on the other hand, Virginia would slowly but surely expand westward, would reach the slopes of the Appalachian Mountains in the early 1700s, expand over them into the Shenandoah Valley into the mid-1700s, and expand beyond that in years to come, and fighting with Indians along the way. Now, Virginia is just one, although certainly the largest colony in the colonial region we describe as the Chesapeake, because it lies around the Chesapeake Bay. But alongside Virginia, we also group in Maryland, and sometimes Delaware, which economically was pretty similar to other Chesapeake colonies, but politically was largely separate from them. Maryland was also different from Virginia in another way, which is that it was created to be a haven for Catholics, who in the mid-1500s and throughout the 1600s, in some ways up into the 1800s, they faced some, and sometimes very significant, legal limitations and a lot of persecution in England and Scotland. Even though in the mid-1600s, the kings of England were largely sympathetic to the Catholics in their country. Indeed, in 1634, King Charles I granted a portion of what we might call Virginia to a Catholic nobleman who named it Maryland. And that would then be a proprietary colony belonging to George Calvert, the Lord Baltimore, and later other Calverts who inherited the title of Lord Baltimore and the proprietary colony of Maryland in the New World. Again, Lord Baltimore, in principle, being in complete control of Maryland, just as the king, in principle, was in complete control of England. But and they made it a haven for Catholics. And many Catholics moved there. But while they were Catholic, they were still English. And they wanted a say in the government too, just as people did in the English Parliament back home. And so pretty soon, Virginia created a Maryland created a General Assembly, in which which was an elected legislature, not unlike the House of Commons in England. And while certainly many Catholics moved to Maryland, and most of the large landowners in the local upper class were Catholics, many Protestants moved there as well. There was some fighting in Maryland during the English Civil War, both within the colony and between the colony and parliamentary forces who tried to seize it. And eventually the Catholics in the General Assembly worried that as more and more Protestants moved to Maryland, they might gain enough votes to pass the kind of laws in Maryland that limited the rights of Catholics back in England. And so while they were still in charge, the Catholics of Maryland passed the Act of Religious Toleration in 1649, offering toleration to all Christians, although not other groups, so that once Catholics ceased to be the majority, as eventually happened, their rights would still be protected. And even when Protestants did come to outnumber Catholics in Maryland, the Catholics who had gotten there first did tend to be culturally and politically and economically very powerful, very influential in Maryland. Thank you very much, and tomorrow we will talk about the Puritans who would settle in New England.